All right, so let's talk through a couple of our examples here. So our first example is to convert 3,200 yards to hectometers. So let's kind of put together just a quick plan here. Now, yards is the American system, and then hectometers is the metric system. So that does mean we do need to switch systems, which means that in terms of our conversion factors, we can use either this one to switch or this one to switch between our metric system and the American system. So you just have to pick whichever one you're going to use. For this example, I'm going to use the second one as the 1 inch equals 2.54 centimeters. Now let's kind of put together a plan here. So we have yards, and the overall goal is to get into hectometers. Now, with this in mind, we picked a conversion factor that has inches and centimeters in it. Now, that does mean that somewhere, if we're starting in yards, somewhere in there, we're going to be going from inches to centimeters. And now let's kind of put together the rest of the plan. Now, yards, as we try and get yards to inches, our first step would be to go yards to feet. Then from feet to inches, because we know that there's 12 inches in every foot. And we're also given that for every yard, there's 3 feet. So we can go from yards to feet, feet to inches, then inches to centimeters. And then from centimeters to hectometers, we can do because we know King Henry. So because we know that, let's kind of go through now and set up everything to convert. So we start off with what we're given, so 3,200 yards, and then we'll put it over 1. Now let's go through, and we said our first step is to convert yards to feet. So we look at our conversion factor, and we want feet. We got yards, so we placed our units. Then next should be to go from feet to inches. And so if we want to go from feet to inches, it would be then going from, there are 12 inches in every 1 foot. Then we'll place our next units to go from inches to centimeters. So 2.54 centimeters for every 1 inch. And then finally, we'll go from centimeters to hectometers. So we want hectometers. We got centimeters at this point. And now let's just count. So remember, if in this case, the higher up or further to the left is the 1, the further to the right, in this case, is the 10, just because of how I wrote it. So that does mean that hecto gets the 1 and centi gets the power of 10. And then when we count, we should see that it's to the 4th power. So now we can go through and plug this into our calculator. And as we go through and plug this in, we should get 29.3 hectometers. All right, so let's look at another example. A little bit different this time. But this time we have to convert 100 decagrams to pounds. So, decagrams, pounds. Okay, now let's look at our conversion factors. And here we have 1 pound is equal to 454 grams. So that does mean that in order to find pounds, we first need to find grams. So we can convert decagrams to regular grams using our King Henry. And so if it's deca, remember that's the capital D. And grams happens to be in the U. So that's where the grams falls under. And so that does mean we do need to convert now from decagrams to regular grams. So as we convert, our first conversion factor should be going from decagrams to regular grams. So we want grams, we got decagrams, we'll place those so they cancel. Then let's look at our higher up, in this case is the deca, so it gets the 1. The lower down is our base unit, regular grams, and it only happens to be 1 spot. All right, so now decagrams cancels, leaving us with just grams. And now let's turn grams into pounds. So we look at our conversion factor list, And we see that for every 1 pound, there are 454 regular grams. So now we'll go through and we'll place this. Chance, stop it. So now after we go through and place this, we end up getting 2.2 pounds. All right, let's look at another example here. And this one, using scientific notation, convert 2.5 times 10 to the 11th millimeters to miles. So let's go through. So we have 2.50 times 10 to the 11th millimeters, and we're trying to get to miles. So just like before, if we're trying to go from millimeters to something else, in this case, it's a different system. And so that does mean we need to use one of our system switches. So we either need to use the 1 mile is equal to 1.609 kilometers, or we need to use 1 inch is equal to 2.54 centimeters. Now for this one, since we're trying to get miles in the end, we're going to use this conversion factor here, which means that all we need to do in terms of looking at our units here is we need kilometers in order to find miles. Well, if that's the case, that means that in reality, there's only one step. We got to go from millimeters to kilometers, and then we can go from kilometers to miles. So we'll make that arrow much bigger. Now we know how to do millimeters to kilometers from our King Henry. So we can do it that way. And so let's kind of go through and let's set up our conversion factor here. And so now if we want kilometers, we got millimeters. Remember, obviously the K is the king, and that gets the 1 for kilo. And then milli would be our power of 10. And then if we count, we go through the whole thing, which means that it's 6 spots. So now we're left with kilometers, and we can convert kilometers to miles by just doing 1 mile over our 1.609 kilometers. And so we can go through and plug this into our calculator, and we're going to get 155,376 miles. Or if you wanted to round, which is okay because that's a lot to write, you can write it as 155,000 miles. All right, and let's look at one more example here of our factor labeling. And this time it is to convert 0.35 feet per second to kilometers per hour. So now, keep in mind, we're trying to go feet per second to kilometers per hour or per year. Wow. And so that does mean that we need to go first in terms of our distance. The important things that we need to know is how to go from feet to kilometers. Now, what we can do is we basically have 2 options. We could go all the way to inches with our feet, or we can go to miles. Now, I'm going to do this first option, but you could still do the second option. So if that's the case, second option being this one, I need to turn feet into miles. So our plan is we're going to turn feet to miles, and then from miles to our kilometers. Now, let's look at our time. Now, in terms of our time, we have to go from seconds to years. So we're first going to go from seconds to minutes, then minutes to hours, hours to days, and then days to years. So we got a lot to do for our time here. Now let's go through and set this up. So if we're going to do that, we're going to start off with our 0.35 feet per second. So we're going to put it over 1 second. So now let's just do the distance part first. So we have to convert feet to miles. So we know that based on our conversion factor list, that for every 1 mile, there is 5,280 feet. Then feet cancels, leaving us with miles. We can convert miles to kilometers. And so as we do that, we're going to do 1.609 kilometers over 1 mile. And so now miles should cancel out, leaving us with just kilometers. And so now kilometers being one of the target units that we're looking for, we have it and it's not canceled out. So we're done with our distance part. Now let's look back at the time. So if we're doing the time, since seconds is on the bottom initially, we need to place seconds on the top over here in order to cancel it out, which means that if we look at our plan here, seconds to minutes, perfect. So minutes would be on the bottom, and we know that there are 60 seconds per minute. Now seconds cancels, leaving us with minutes. Now let's go through and turn minutes into hours. So we know that there are 60 minutes in every 1 hour. Minutes cancels. Then we cancel out hours by knowing there are 24 hours in a day. So hours cancels. And then we can cancel out days by knowing that there are 365 days for every 1 year. And then days cancels. So in terms of our units, the units that we have are kilometers on top and years on the bottom, which is perfect because that's what we're trying to find, kilometers per year. So we can now go through and plug this into our calculator. And as we plug this into our calculator, remember, just do step by step. And in fact, this one, I strongly encourage you to try it out. But you should end up getting 3,363 kilometers over 1 year or years. All right, so that's it for this one. And now let's kind of go through and let's talk a little bit about how we can measure. And so there's a bunch of different examples here. And what we're going to do is we're just going to kind of go through and look at what place or measurement we can actually get to. Now, for this one of the important things that we should kind of know here is that for this, as we're looking at it, let's just kind of make a list here as our kind of spots. Oop. And so there's our kind of measurement points, we'll call it. And remember, in the center there is our decimal. So starting from the left, we have the hundreds, then the tens, then the ones. Then after that decimal point, it goes to the tenths, the hundredths, and the thousandths. So now let's kind of look at our examples here. And so for our first example, we have a 100 milliliter graduated cylinder that has increments of 5 milliliters. Now, the important thing here is that the increments are 5 milliliters. Now, that does indicate that we know the ones place. So we know this spot here. But since it's not a 1, that is actually where we estimate to. So even though the increments give us the ones place, since this number or this increment isn't a 1, then that's what we're going to actually estimate to. So for here, we're going to estimate or measure to the ones place. So an example would be like 55 milliliters or 38 milliliters or let's do like 12. So all of those would be good readings that we can take for this one. All right, so now let's look at our next example. And so for our next example, we have a 100 milliliter graduated cylinder with increments of 1 milliliter. Okay, so now if we know this spot, we know the ones place. This time, since it is in fact a 1, we're going to be estimating to the next spot. So in this case, we're estimating to the tenths. So here, our measurements are going to the tenths, which means that in terms of our measurements, some of our measurements could be like 97.3 milliliters or 22.4 milliliters or I don't know, 70 6.1 milliliters. So all of those would be good measurements for this one. All right, let's look at our next example then. Now this time we have a 10 milliliter graduated cylinder with increments of 0.1 milliliters. So we know all the way down to this spot, which means that we're estimating the next spot over. So in this case, we're estimating the hundredths place. And hundredths is kind of a big word, so we'll see if I can squeeze all three examples in. So if we're talking about measurements to the hundredths place, here, remember it's only a 10 milliliter graduated cylinder, so it could be something like 5.22 milliliters or 3.50 milliliters. Remember, it's okay if there's zeros included there, or even, let's say 7.94 milliliters. So all of those are good measurements for this one. All right, so let's look again at another example. And this time it's a 5 milliliter graduated cylinder with increments of 0.2 milliliters. So we know this spot, but remember, since it's not all the way down to the ones that we know, that's what we're going to be measuring to or estimating to. So for this one, we're estimating to the tenths place. Now, if we're estimating to the tenths place, that does mean that in our 5 milliliter graduated cylinder, we could measure like 3.7 milliliters or 4.9 milliliters or 2.1 milliliters. All of those are good measurements. All right, let's look at another one. Now, this time we're given a 1,000 milliliter graduated cylinder with increments of 10 milliliters. So that means we know the tens place, and since it's all the way down to the tens, we're estimating to the ones. So that means that in terms of our estimation, it's the ones, which means that some of our measurements could be something like, and remember it's 1,000 milliliters, so it could be something like 572 milliliters, it could be 738, or it could be 125. So all of those would be good measurements. All right, and let's look at one more example, and this time it is a 50 milliliter graduated cylinder with increments of 2 milliliters. So if we know down to this spot, but it's the twos instead of the ones, that means that this is still what we're estimating to. So for this one, this is another one where we're estimating to the ones. So let's kind of look at some examples then. And so if we're estimating to the ones, that means that some of our measurements could be like 45 milliliters, it could be 26 milliliters, or it could be 33 milliliters. So all of those would be good examples for our measurements there. All right, I hope that helps. Let me know if you have any other questions.